We will get started because this is that most important hour, the hour before lunch. So I'm competing with increasing boredom and hunger at the same time. So hopefully, the subject is somewhat complicated, but we'll hope that it works out. So let's see if we can focus and get it as big as possible. I'm sorry because I submitted my materials and I said in the request, please print the employee handbook that's on the Waco website, and you can see you don't have it. So, but it is on the website, so it's kind of moot. But what I'm going to do is go use that as the example of what can and cannot be done, okay? So I brought it up on my computer and got it up on the screen, and we will improvise, which is what we do when we're, see if I can get this to come back. I don't know how far I can go before I create a tripping hazard here. Good. All right, is this all the brighter that this gets? Yeah. Everybody can take a nice nap. So. Push down on something there. We'll be plunged into darkness in but a moment. Yeah. There we go. It's a computer operator. Hey. I know a down arrow. Next thing you know, we'll be slicing bread. There you go. Okay, so we're going to talk about employee handbooks, why you should have them, what the purpose of an employee handbook is, and what are some of the conditions that they should have. Now, the handbook that is on the Waco website is going to be the model that we use for this, but certainly you should feel free to modify that or add to it or subtract to it as you feel is necessary. This is what it says at the beginning. It's a sample, it's for discussion purposes only. It does say what all handbooks should say. You're an equal opportunity employer, okay? And then it has, you'll see a blank to tell you when you adopted it, when it became effective, and when it was amended. So, and as you change your handbook, every time you change it, print a copy of the, make sure you print a copy of the old version and save a couple of copies of it. Then print the new one and make sure there's a date. Why is that important? Because you may need to document what your employment policies were at a particular moment in time. So if you're going to have an employee handbook, make sure that you can produce it. It's very embarrassing when a lawyer for the other side serves a discovery request and says, do you have an employee handbook? If so, produce a copy of all versions of that handbook which were in effect during the time that the employee was employed. And you can't do it. That's not good, okay? You want to be careful to make sure you can produce what you have used. Why do we have a handbook? Well, there are many terms and conditions of employment that we have today, and it's a lot easier than trying to say them orally to everybody. It's a lot easier than trying to remember what you've told everybody, because that becomes it makes it very difficult to be consistent, okay? We also have a handbook because we want to lay down the basic terms and conditions of employment to employees, but we want to make sure that we don't miscommunicate them, okay? Now, if you were in the previous seminar, I won't belabor this, but in Wisconsin, and for that matter, for anybody else, I won't belabor it. In Wisconsin, employment is an at-will relationship. That means that you're free to hire people and fire them, and they're free to take a job and quit. The employer is free to change the conditions of employment. The employee is free to say, I'd like more money, please pay me more. And the employer can say, well, I'll pay you this much more, but not that much, okay? It's a free will relationship. It can be changed at any time. It is important to have a handbook so that you document what your terms and conditions are, but at the same time, make clear that you are not creating a binding employment contract, okay? One of the first statements in this handbook is very important. It says, I acknowledge receipt of a copy of the employee handbook. I also acknowledge that its provisions are guidelines subject to revision by the employer at any time and are not a contract of any kind between me and the employer. It's one thing to say, this is what the wage rates and the terms of employment are for now. It's another to say, I promise that I will pay you X dollars of an hour for an indefinite period of time until the end of 2020. That's a definite employment contract, okay? And that's something, if you breach it, that can be enforced. Your handbook has to say that it is not an employment contract. It is simply a summary of the terms and conditions that apply during the employment. What do we put in an employee handbook? Well, we put everything that we would like to communicate to the employee. I recommend that you might want to have a table of organization. This isn't that difficult to do if you have some elementary skills, which is what I would characterize my abilities in Word or PowerPoint. And then this preface says in very somewhat more formal language than I just said, this handbook is not intended to and does not constitute an employment contract between the employer and any of its employees. No individual employer official has any authority to enter into an oral or written promise or contract of employment. In other words, it's a more elaborate way of saying we can change the rules anytime we want. Okay, that's also very important. Employment principles and objectives. You're hired to do a job and you're hired to make a contribution. This is meant to be a motivational statement. You can look at that and fine tune it to see how it complies with your own particular features. I have a blank in here for a history. It's kind of nice to give your employees a little bit of history of your business if you know it. Many of the campgrounds that are members of Waco have been around for a long time. Some of you are second or third or other owners, or it's been a family business. People like to buy into a culture. You know, if you can say, there's been a campground at Icy River for 75 years because we have found ways to give people great experiences. That helps, that creates a sense of pride, and it's useful to do that, okay? Of course, your own history is what goes here. Function and governance of the employer. I put a provision in here about discipline, that is to say that standards of conduct are necessary. The employer retains the right to terminate any employee's employment without cause at any time or to impose discipline as determined at the discretion of the employer at any time. Now this kind of relates to a point that comes up. I have people ask me fairly frequently when they are at-will employers. There's no union, there's no contract. They say, well, should we put employees on probation when they're hired? The reality is it's superfluous to do that because when you're an at-will employer, employees are always on probation. That is, they can be fired at any time without cause. If you want to, if there's a valid reason for informing employees that you have some level of expectations or some allowance for problems or something, if you want to tell them that you're in an orientation period, and during the orientation period, different rules may apply, well, that's fine. But if you tell someone that they're a probationary employee and after 90 days they will be a regular employee, the question gets to be, well, what's different? Okay, and sometimes the implication can be given, once you're no longer on probation, you're a regular employee. That is, you won't be fired, you know, without cause, and you don't want to do anything that implies that, okay? So I generally do not think the term probationary employee is terribly useful. Like I say, everybody's always on probation. Equal employment opportunity statement. These days, equal employment opportunity is more than a given. It's a strong expectation that everybody has. I think we all know that we are required to avoid discriminating against people on the basis of the protected categories of race, color, religion, sex, age, national origin, disability, or other protected characteristics. More than that, I think we also realize that there are positive aspects to this, that we benefit from making sure that everybody in our society has a chance to participate and a chance to be part of the economy, have jobs, support their families, and the like. The Equal Rights Division and the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission like it when they see that an employee handbook has an equal employment statement. It's a positive thing. It makes it look like you are committed to it, and you should. Non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. In the past 2 years, we have seen the most profound shift in attitudes and awareness of sexual harassment and harassment in general that has happened in my lifetime. Harvey Weinstein getting sent to prison for 23 years is a small piece of that. The broader sense of it has been that throughout the economy, throughout the culture, people are finally recognizing that women particularly have been very poorly treated by men. I know women know that, but men are finally being forced to acknowledge that, oh my goodness, this is not acceptable. You know, it really is amazing how much the culture has changed. I had a case 15 years ago where a woman who was working in a restaurant that I represented was being grabbed repeatedly by one of the cooks. And when I mean grab, I mean in the most humiliating and intimate way possible. She complained to the manager several times, and he basically said to her, look, I need this cook, so just deal with it. In other words, I can replace you, but I can't replace a cook all that easily. And it happened over and over again. And we filed a complaint. She wound up quitting, and we filed a complaint alleging sexual harassment. This was bad. She was actually sexually assaulted, okay? And she called the police and reported it. It is sexual assault if you touch a person in an intimate place on their body without their consent. That's 4th-degree sexual assault in Wisconsin. While the police were investigating it, we filed this complaint, and the employer's attorney called me up, and he said, what the hell are you doing filing this complaint? And I said, I'm seeking the remedies that the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act allowed. And he goes, you're stupid, this is crazy. My employer's supposed to pay thousands of dollars because a cook grabs somebody in the ass. And I said, yeah, he is. But that attitude, you know, you used to get that a lot. People would say, oh, come on, it's just the way men are. He's just, you know, a little pinch does, you know. No, it's not the way men are. It can't be. It really can't be. We need to be better than that. We really do. We need to, and this is not stupid. This is not trivial. It's about giving women the opportunity to participate in our society, which not only do they deserve, we need. We need the help, okay? So what is illegal? Well, what's illegal is certainly any physical contact that is unwelcome, okay? And frankly, the best way to deal with that is just to have an understanding with your employees that the workplace is not where you have physical entanglements of any kind. And it goes both ways, men and women both. Because women today do get rowdy with men too. You know, it happens. If you're going to have personal interactions, do them on your own time. That we're here to work, we're here to take care of our customers, okay? The hard part gets to be verbal stuff, which can be just as intimidating and just as embarrassing. And even more than that, the stuff that gets to be really subjective and difficult to document, like he was looking at me funny. You know, frankly, those are very hard to prove or disprove. You have to come from the standpoint of understanding that people really do behave poorly and have bad attitudes and need to be corrected, okay? So what do you do? Well, first of all, if somebody actually, sexual harassment, which is where you condition you make unwelcome sexual advances to other employees, you try to condition employment, you try to impose quid pro quo conditions on them. Those things need to be dealt with quite severely. They need to be investigated promptly when problems arise, and you need to take effective action against the people who perpetrate it. And this policy here explains and provides guidance. We also make sure that we indicate retaliation is prohibited. You cannot retaliate against somebody for making a complaint, and that can get sometimes very complicated, but it is true. There's a procedure that you have here for making complaints, and you have somebody designated to be the person to hear the complaint. Now this gets to be very sensitive because we're small employers and there's only a few people that are in the management ranks. Sometimes if there's a complaint against a family member, for example, like your son was touching me, or your husband was touching me, or your wife was touching me, that can get really delicate. Find somebody outside the campground to investigate those kinds of matters, whether it's a lawyer or somebody that you know that does human resources, but boy, that's tough. But don't try to investigate it yourself. This manual has a policy on people with disabilities. It indicates that we have a policy of accommodating disabilities. That said, it says that the employer will determine the feasibility of the requested accommodation by considering various factors, including the nature and the cost of the accommodation, availability of tax credits, outside funding, the employer's financial resources and organization, and the impact of the operation on the employer and its ability. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act both are qualified. The requirement that you have to accommodate employees are qualified by the fact that employers are not required to undertake something that would be a hardship. Okay, I will tell you that in practice, what constitutes a hardship is fairly draconian in the eyes of the people. So if it's going to cost you $100,000, for example, that's probably a hardship. If it's going to cost you $5,000 or $10,000, that's going to be marginal. So be prepared, be forewarned that that's not going to be that's not going to be easy. The Americans with Disabilities Act and the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act, however, do not require that you employ people to do jobs whose essential elements are beyond their capacity, okay? We have lots of jobs because campgrounds are outdoor enterprises. There are jobs that require that people be able to be mobile over varied terrain, some of which may not have hardscape surface, maybe natural trails or just grass or wooded terrain where you have roots and other things. It may be very difficult for people who have mobility limitations to traverse that in an efficient manner. It may not be possible for them to handle the kinds of jobs that involve groundskeeping or working outside. Certainly someone who can't swim is not physically cannot swim, is not qualified to be a lifeguard, for example. So there are significant limits to who you're obligated to employ. In the previous session, I made a fairly strong pitch for the importance of the job descriptions, and I continue to believe that that's true. If for no other reason, job descriptions are important because they serve to give you a basis for defining what the essential elements of your jobs are, okay? They tell you what you can and cannot do. Give you an example of what that means. I'll pick on you. Gary, do you have any public works people in Montello?
Yes.
And you have more than a few manholes in Montello, right? At least 5 or 6, right?
At least.
Yeah. Do you think you could hire somebody to work in public works who is not capable of climbing down into a manhole?
If they stay above during the safety requirements of someone being in a confined environment, yes, they probably could.
Okay, but you have to have...
Going down into the manhole, no.
Yeah. So if everybody on your crew had to have the ability to do the manhole duty. Another example, this is the city of Montello, but you know, if you had, the water guys came to my house a couple of years ago and they had to fix a leak in the water main. And they had to excavate that out, and then they got down in the trench and had the, you know, they had the trenching tools to hold it open. That's not something you can do unless you're very agile and very mobile. The point I'm getting at is that there genuinely are physical elements that are part of every job, and if you define them in job descriptions and you have this statement in a handbook, you have protected yourselves from spurious claims by people seeking accommodations for which they are just not qualified. Okay? To do jobs they're not qualified to do. Come on. Come back. Come back. Please come back. There we go. Yay. All right. So, we next talk about employees and employee salaries. It says that the employee shall be hired there are various classifications of employees. A regular full-time employee who is scheduled to work 40 hours a week, 52 hours a week. We don't have many of those. Regular part-time, seasonals, limited term, casuals. These are, you may not have these classifications. It's for you to react to and decide what you want. It does mention that there may be exempt employees, that is people that don't get paid overtime. Probably that won't apply to you because since we are seasonal businesses, we don't pay overtime. I checked the federal law between the first session and this one, and I concluded that virtually all of our campgrounds in Wisconsin are going to be exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act requirement of paying overtime because we do all of our business in the concentrated part of the year, and the lowest 6 months of the year do not generate more than 33% of our income. It's going to be very highly concentrated. Outside employment, we have this has a provision that says that you restrict people from having outside employment without permission. It's legal for an employer to say, if you work here, you can't work anywhere else without my permission. This was written a few years ago when the job market wasn't as tight as it is now. It may be that you don't want to push that, but there are situations where you just may not want somebody working more than one job and you want them to commit that they're going to give you priority. That's up to you, okay? Hours of work and requests for scheduling changes. This is where you can define what hours of work you actually want people to be there for. Now, in every work week, in every schedule for the purpose of paying wages, employers have to define a base week, okay? Most regular employers like us will say that a work week is from midnight on Sunday to 11:59 p.m. the following Saturday. But depending, it may not work. You might want to do it Monday through Sunday because weekend work is a unit. It depends, whichever you want. But you got to define one standard work week, and that's what you use for calculating overtime and paying wages, okay? You can also put schedules down and say, you know, our regular work hours for people who work for us are going to be 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. or whatever works for you, okay? Or you may have split shifts where you say to people, I want you to be there from 7 to 11, you're off for 3 hours, and then you come back at 2 o'clock and you work another 4 hours. It's up to you. You can define the hours pretty much as you see fit, subject to two things. What you can hire, what people are willing to do, what people, you know, if you tell somebody, I'm going to work you 4 hours, then I'm going to have you off for 3 hours, and you're going to come back and work for 4 more hours, they're not going to like that. And like, oh, really? I'm supposed to devote 11 hours of every day to you effectively? But if you pay them enough, they may be willing to do it. Overtime comp, I'm not going to spend any time on that. This is the policy you'd have if you were subject to it. Attendance, believe it or not, the law actually, there's actually case law that says, that questions whether it is essential for employees to attend work. That is, why can't we be absent? You know, we're still doing we're still thinking about the employer. obviously, campgrounds are the kind of employment where you need to physically be there. You can't. Right. Well, like most is right. But, you know, when I'm here in Stevens Point, I'm actually doing work for my law practice because it's we can do it electronically now. But most jobs still require some component of being there in person. So that's something that you want to state specifically in your manual to make clear that you do not allow people to work at home or other locations in lieu of reporting to the employer, okay? Compensation. There's a wage schedule which governs payments. Adjustments are discretionary. I talked about this in the first session. I'll just reiterate that you really you don't want to have wage rates being ad hoc. You pick one rate for one person, pick another for another, all over the map. You want to have a wage schedule that is tied to a position. It should be reasonable in light of market conditions. You can give people step increases for experience, or you can have step increases that just say based on performance, we may give you, another 25 cents an hour or something like that. But treat people consistently or you will have trouble, okay? Pay periods. I often recommend that you put a thing in there telling people when they're going to get paid and how they're going to get paid. It is increasingly common for employers to require everybody to get their pay electronically, and this is evolving quite a bit. There are now payroll services out there which not only pay people electronically, but they will pay people up to the minute. So you can go on to the payroll site and you can draw your pay through today. Some people that actually is a good thing from the standpoint of a lot of people who are in the entry level range of the pay scale, because it has helped a lot of people avoid the need for payday loans, because they can draw 3 or 4 days of pay rather than going to the payday lender and having to pay fantastic rates of interest for it. It references time cards. Whether you use time cards or time sheets, or whether you have people check in with some kind of a computer punch-in system, you do need to keep track of when people work, when they report, when they're off, and when they're on breaks and the like. It's important for wage and hour reporting, and it's also important for determining liability for worker comp injuries and other issues related to whether people actually were on the job or not.
Are breaks required by law?
Good question. Are breaks required by law? Not for adults. You can actually, and there are jobs where people work 8 straight hours. Okay.
When are you an adult?
18. If you're a minor in Wisconsin, you're required to get 30 minutes off after 6 hours of continuous employment if you're under 18. As a practical matter, most employers provide breaks, and if you provide employees with breaks, if they are free to pursue personal, like for example, personal distractions like checking their smartphone, seeing what's on Facebook, that kind of stuff, which they do on work anyway, but if they're free to decide what they're going to do, and in theory to leave the premises of the employer, if only briefly, you don't have to pay them for that. If you require them to stay on the property and be available for return to duty at a moment's notice, that probably will have to be a paid break. So it depends on how you want to treat it. It also is important to specify, if you allow it or you don't allow it, whether you want to allow people to change their starting and quitting times. Most employers don't. Most employers say, look, you get a 15-minute break in the morning. If you don't use it, you lose it. You get a half an hour for lunch. If you don't use it, you lose it. You can't put your 2 breaks and your lunch together and leave an hour early. We need you here till 5. Okay?
Mark,
Yeah.
can you offer a break, and if they choose not to take it, is that okay?
Yes, it is. But if they wind up working 8.5 hours, because of that, you got to pay them for the extra half hours. So you'd have to send them home early. If it's a paid break, they don't have to take it, though. Okay?
Even if it's a minor?
If minors, you have to give a break to.
But
They don't
if
have a
don't
choice.
take it, If they say, oh no, I'm good, they still have.
No,
to-
you have to make them.
Yeah.
You have to, if they don't, you have to discipline them to stop, make them take a break. You know, believe me, most miners don't have a problem with taking a break, so they're pretty good.
If you let them use their phone, though, they'll never get in 6 hours of continuous work.
Well, that's true. By the way, that reminds me of something, and that is at concerts, this is starting to happen all over the place. There are these, it's called locking up your phone. Have anybody heard of this? I just read about this. It's really a neat idea. There's a company that makes these Ziploc bags, there's like zipper bags, and people put their phones in them, zip them shut, and turn them in, and they get a receipt back for them, and they're soundproof, so that during a concert, phones don't go off. People are not texting. People are not being distracted. I think you're going to see those becoming very, very widespread at workplaces and at church. Would you please lock your phone? I'm serious. And it's
save money by just turning it off and putting it in your vehicle.
well, that's right. But
Find a Ziploc bag that's soundproof is silly. But
well, but you know, the performers who are doing it now said that they started doing it because they got so tired of being in the middle of a song and having it interrupted by somebody's phone going off, usually with their competitor's song. You know, so
complaining that people are videotaping them and putting them on social media.
that also, that's another problem. Okay, moving on. Vacation time and paid time off scheduling. Because we're seasonal, very few of us are going to have either vacation or paid time off. If you do, have a policy on it and look at this policy. I'm not even going to spend any time on it because I don't think it's a big deal. Use of paid time off for illness and caretaking. Again, I don't think most of us are going to have paid time off, and we're not going to deal with this. There is an issue for those employees who have actually worked more than 1,250 hours in the previous 12 months. Okay, that's the cutoff, and you have to have, under Wisconsin law, you have to have only one employee to be covered by Wisconsin medical leave, which gives you certain leave rights, but you don't have to pay them. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. It's more elaborate than here. It's an unusual situation. Holidays. If you have paid holidays, put them in here. If you don't, you should maybe mention that. Does anybody here pay for holiday time at all? I can't imagine. You do? Okay. For your regular employees or for your seasonals or what?
Year-round employee.
Year-round employees. That needs to be specified here. Of course, your seasonals work the holidays because you're open, right? I mean, you don't close on July 4th and send all the campers home. Sorry. You know. Got to have people there to staff the marina or whatever. Religious holidays. Fortunately, there aren't many religious holidays that fall during the summer. Of course, there are a few, but and depending, some religions, the holidays move around the year, so they might fall during the summer occasionally. But by and large, this shouldn't be a big issue for campgrounds. But it is a good policy to accommodate people's desire to observe their religious holidays by letting them take time off without pay. You do not have to pay people. You do not have to pay people. Leaves of absence without pay. This is a policy that is optional, of course. You don't have to have it. If you do, you should define it. If you're going to let people take time off at all, so that you treat everybody the same, you should have a policy and you should put it in a handbook. Okay. And that the funeral leave. I have a feeling that there isn't a decent employer in the world that would say, no, you can't go to your father-in-law's funeral, right? Of course, you let people have that day off and a day after or a day for prep or something like that. But again, if you don't define what your policy is, you're going to find yourself being pushed into doing more than you would like and being taken advantage of by people. So have a policy that defines these things. Jury duty. Employers in Wisconsin are required to give people time off for jury duty. So if one of your employees gets summoned to be on the jury, they have to go, and you have to let them go. You don't have to pay them, however. I would say, though, that if you want to be a good, upstanding citizen, you should pay them the difference between the $16 they get from the county for serving on a jury and their wages. Why do you do that, folks? If it ever comes your turn to be in a jury trial and you see who shows up, you'll say, oh, I wish better people would be willing to serve on juries. So we all have an obligation to make that possible. Voting. Wisconsin has a law that allows people to take up to 2 hours to vote in all elections, but it requires that they go right to the polls and come back. I will say, you know, come on, the polls are open till 8. You can vote early in Wisconsin. It's not essential, but if people ask you for it and there's a special election, which there might be one, for example, for Congress in the 7th District this summer, let them go. They have the right to vote. There's a policy on worker compensation. Worker compensation is a matter of state law. This is designed to reinforce it. Very important that, as it says here, people must report all accidents or injuries, no matter how minor, to the employer immediately or submit a written report within 24 hours. They have to submit a doctor's report, and they have to assist in completing the paperwork. I'll repeat, you know, forgive me, I'm going to repeat a few things I said earlier this morning, so forgive me if you were in there, but it's really important to get those employers' first report of accident or injuries, because that documents what happened, mostly to avoid exaggeration, okay? Somebody comes back 6 weeks later and says, oh man, I cut off the tip of my finger back then and it became infected and now I lost my finger. Oh really? Well, why didn't you go to the doctor? Well, I just didn't think it was that big a deal. The fact that they didn't file a report of accident or injury gives the insurance company some ammunition to argue that there wasn't an accident or injury, but it's far better for the insurance company's purposes and therefore for yours for there to be a report so that the employer can document, oh my goodness, the employee who said I cut off the tip of my finger, they just scratched it a little bit. But I offered to take them to the doctor. They declined, so we offered first aid. I watched them sanitize it and put on a Band-Aid. You know, you never want to tell somebody you can't go to the doctor for a workplace injury. I don't care how minor it is and how stupid it is. You'll only regret it if you do, okay? Bonds, I don't think many of us have bonded employees. You might want to tell people that you have liability insurance, a policy on safety. This commits the employer to use safety provisions. It also requires employees to follow the directions that they're given about safe practices. I don't know if, I'm sure that there are all kinds of things that people do on campgrounds where there's a right way to do it and many wrong ways to do it. Any of you require that any of your employees wear lime green vests or clothing when they're doing certain things like walking in the road or whatever? Has that become a requirement yet? Outside, yeah. Make sure they're visible. You know, if I had employees who were working at night and out where anywhere where they'd be mixing with cars, I would want them to wear one of those lime green vests that has the Scotch Guard reflective stuff on it so they can be seen. But whatever safety equipment is there, make sure they're required to use it. I don't think we need few of us are going to need a policy on health insurance for our seasonals, but for regular employees, if you provide health insurance, you definitely need to have something here that describes what you pay and what you cover, okay? Life insurance, long-term disability, this policy has a lot more than what you're going to need, okay? Voluntary resignation, leaving the employment of the employer. Voluntary resignation is defined as a voluntary termination initiated by the employee. You're required to give at least 2 weeks notice, and you'll give the notification to the administrator. Now, one thing I would suggest very strongly, it's based on individual circumstances, but if an employee gives you 2 weeks notice, you should think very seriously about paying them the 2 weeks and letting them off right away. Depends on the person. Some people you can trust to do a good job for you for the next 2 weeks, but frankly, a lot of people lose all interest in being, nice people, having good morale, and we're above all in the business of providing good experiences and good customer service. We cannot afford to have somebody out on the campground who is going to do anything less than provide us with optimal service. So that's something to think about. Layoffs, I don't think many of us do that except at the end of the season. How many people, retirement, I'm not going to deal with. Performance evaluations. If you have employees who are employed year-round and on an ongoing basis, I suppose there is some temptation to have performance reviews. If you're going to do them, take the time to be honest and to be careful in what you say about people. If your review is going to be nothing more than, nice job, keep up the good work, don't bother, okay? What you're really trying to do is identify areas where people could benefit from additional training or additional experience or additional guidance, and where they can improve themselves. Employer equipment and property. All employees are expected to exercise due care in the use of employer property and to utilize the property only for authorized purposes. Construction companies are always dealing with this problem because their employees are notorious for scabbing. That is, they take the employer's equipment on weekends and go off and do work on their own and make money on the side. Some employers actually tolerate that because they know that the employees can net a lot of cash that way and help them. I would be very reluctant if I were you to see my tools or equipment used for anything other than employer purposes. You have no idea what's going to happen. Somebody comes along and says, hey, I got to cut a limb off at home. There's a limb that's hanging over my parents' house. Can I borrow the chainsaw and take it home to cut off that limb? No. That's why there's Easy Rental or other rental services. Sorry, but you can't handle the liability. Chainsaws are probably the most dangerous piece of equipment that we give people to use outdoors. The last thing in the world you want to let people alone. But frankly, even something like a hammer or a screwdriver, people may injure themselves with it and blame you, and it may not ever come back. So just keep your stuff where it's at. People need to get their own equipment. Searches and inspections. This says something that's very important. Employees, that's campground employees, have no right of privacy in any part of the employer's offices, buildings, vehicles, property, or premises, including computers. Okay, so if somebody is on your computer and they want to log into their personal Facebook page, which they shouldn't do, you shouldn't let them, because that's a great way to get viruses and other problems with your computers. But if they do that, you have the right to say, hey, you have put your personal information on my computer, it's fair game. Okay, I need to see whether you've compromised our business by putting unnecessary or inappropriate stuff. This has gotten very easy to enforce these days because everybody's got a computer with them right now, these days, and they just don't need to use the workplace computers to access Facebook or Instagram or whatever, or Tinder. Go ahead. Did you have a question?
I do have a question.
Sure.
What if they are using, their personal device, expressing they're having a bad day, and
I'm sorry, say it louder, please.
they're having a bad day at work and they're expressing a little too much information
Yes.
in their post?
Yes.
What right do they have as an employer to speak to employees?
Somebody, you see somebody on Facebook says, Pine Ridge Campground is the worst place in the world to work, or Dell's Timberland is a terrible place. They're such assholes, Interestingly, the National Labor Relations Board under the last administration was drastically limiting the powers of employers to sanction people for their use of social media. That's gotten better. The current labor board has rescinded those policies. I would take what I would characterize as a friendly approach, which is if somebody says, you know, Mark Hazelbaker is the worst person in the world to work for, I'd want to talk to them and I'd say, I'm really disappointed to see that you have posted something on Facebook about this, especially when you didn't come to me and tell me first. You know, if you don't like me or if you're mad at me about something, please feel free. But now that you have done this, I got to ask, what's going on? What can we? I'm not, you know, try to talk them through it. And if that doesn't work, tell them, look, I want you to take that policy down. But the fact is, people are going to do it. How many of you have heard of?
Geared towards the handbook, can I put a statement in there?
Yes.
You're a representative of this company.
Yes.
You are expected to perform.
And you are expected to represent the company during work hours. You are expected to represent the company appropriately in all forums, including social media. Okay. Sure. Has anybody heard of Glassdoor or some of these other work sites? Glassdoor is a place where your employees can, either during or after their employment, put anonymous reviews of what it's like to work for you there. And these days, the younger people, the millennials and young people, very frequently go on those sites before they even apply for a workplace to see what the employees are saying about it. They give numerical ratings, you know, and if they start saying too many things about, I would never work there again, then you're going to have trouble finding employees. So you should make sure you're aware of those services and monitoring what they say about you. Don't think that just because you're up north of Clintonville or outside of Hayward that Glassdoor doesn't have postings about you. I assure you it does. Okay, internet and email policy. This is a very important policy because some of your employees have access to your computers, many of them do. You want to make it unequivocally your policy that the use of the internet is restricted to official employer business, that they're not to be using computers for any improper purpose, and that you have the right to discipline them for sending threatening, slanderous, racially or sexually harassing messages or the like. Okay? The internet, the computers are your resources. They have no right to use them personally. That's what personal devices are for. So if somebody says, well, I got to email my mother, use your phone. But my phone doesn't reach here, use the telephone. Okay, they don't need to be you don't need to have people sending personal emails on your computer. Okay? There's some guidelines here for employee internet and email usage. And I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I encourage you to look at them because they're very important. It's an issue that can cause a lot of damage for employers. And this is about, there's a whole lot of stuff here, probably more than many of us need, about what's involved in the internet usage. Personnel file. This is a Wisconsin statute that you have to allow an employee twice a year to inspect their personnel file, and they have the right to put a written response to the contents of the file in the file. Okay. There's a policy on travel, lodging, and meal policies. That is what is reimbursable and why. There's an expense number in there: lodging, use of personal automobile, travel authorization, etc. I doubt very much that you're going to send most of your seasonal employees by air somewhere, but you may send them into town to pick something up, and you want to make it clear that you will reimburse them for mileage at the IRS rate. If you send them out of town on some business, they can get dinner on, up to a maximum amount, okay? Public relations and affairs. These policies are important for legal reasons and for your own protection of your good name. Solicitation of all kinds and distribution of literature for all reasons is prohibited on all employer property at all times. Why is that? Well, if you don't prohibit solicitation on your property, you are allowing union organizers onto your property, okay? Because employers cannot discriminate against just union organizers. In other words, if you let United Cerebral Palsy or United Way or some charitable organization come onto your property to solicit donations for whatever reason, or if you have people who are allowed to sell Girl Scout cookies, for example, you have opened your property to solicitation and you are required to let union organizers onto it. Now, is that big of a deal for campgrounds? Probably not, because few of us have enough employees that we're targets of union organizers, but you can never tell. It goes on to say that people are required to, this addresses the point you were talking about, maintaining the employer's reputation, that you expect employees to present a positive viewpoint of the employer and to interact in a positive way with the public. Okay? Smoking policy. There's a code of ethics, which you probably aren't going to need too much. So that's the overview of these many, many, many policies that we can have. I covered a lot of material in a quick amount of time, but I'll take a question in a minute. Let me finish, please. How do you put all this together? Well, what is the purpose of a handbook? A handbook is to communicate to the employees what you want them to do, when you want them to do it, how you want them to do it, and what the terms and conditions of their employment are. Okay? Start out by making just a subject outline of the things you feel are important to cover. And the table of contents of this handbook gives you a starting point. You can just say, I don't need that, but I do need this. Okay? There are some things on there that there are some things in there I didn't address. I didn't put a section of work rules in there, but you may want to have some work rules. Okay? From there, you can take the elements of this and fine-tune them to adapt them to your own use and make them more appropriate. Okay? Now your question.
No, just tell me you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. All right, now I will take questions. Go ahead.
I was recommended just a couple years ago, that each employee should receive sexual harassment training, at least 5 minutes worth. So I read the section to them before I hand them the handbook. Is that not necessary? If I'm getting a signature that they've got the handbook and they've read it, do I not need to do that? Or?
Well, sexual harassment is something. It's first of all, I'm not trying to minimize the seriousness of sexual harassment itself. It is very serious. Please understand that. But in many cases, the worst aspect of harassment complaints isn't even the harassment, it's the legal process that you get caught up in, because it can be very intense. Okay? There are factual disputes. Did he say it or didn't he say it? Did it happen or didn't he say it? And it gets very involved and very expensive. You protect yourself from liability by having a policy prohibiting sexual harassment and training your employees in that policy. Okay, so I would recommend that you cover the issue at the beginning of the season with your employees and make it clear it will not be tolerated. Okay, and as you hire people, give them an orientation to it as well. Your point about reading the policy is a good one. People do not read policies. They just don't. You'll give people a handbook and you'll get a signed statement back 5 minutes later, I read it. Okay? And you should tell them, I don't want to see this. I don't want a signed statement in 5 minutes. I want you to actually look at the handbook. Okay? Go ahead.
I have a question about solicitations. If you're partnering with a charity and they solicit for contributions on the property, is that opening yourself up?
You are opening your property to solicitation by third parties. But again, let me just, I say this because it's what I do. I warn people. But, in practical reality, if you've got 5 seasonal employees and your family members and maybe one year-round person, I can't imagine a union's going to be very interested in organizing you. You never know, though. Some of our bigger campgrounds, you never know. Who knows where the world is going? Other questions? So I'm going to be out in the main foyer at my booth and I'll be here till Sunday for the convention. So feel free to grab me and pigeonhole me, and if you have any questions about anything, I'm here. Let me wish you the best season yet for 2020. I'm quite confident the coronavirus we'll get through it. We'll be okay. We've gotten through far worse. We're strong people, and let's hope that everything works out. Thank you very much.